Okay, fabulous. Welcome everyone to the first of this calendar year, I think, seminar in the Global Development series that is organized by DevTrack, which sits in the College of Development Economics and Finance, and of which I am the Dean. So my name is Elisa van Wijnberg, and it's nice to see all of you here. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker and guest, Professor Shiping Tang, who is going to give us a very, very topical talk on the economic development of the Global South in the age of geopolitical upheaval. Let me just say a few things about our speaker before I hand over. Professor Shiping Tang is one of Asia's most influential and innovative social scientists. He was elected as one of the 3 vice presidents in 425-26 of the International Studies Association, and he's the first scholar to be a Chinese scholar to be elected to this position. In 2024, he was honored as one of the 3 distinguished scholars in the Global International Relations section at the ISA convention in San Francisco, along with Barry Buzan and Cristina Rojas. Professor Tan holds the position of Fudan Distinguished Professor and Dr. Seeker Chan Chair at Fudan University in Shanghai, China. He also holds a Changjiang Changkong Scholar Distinguished Professorship from the Chinese Ministry of Education, which is the highest honor a social scientist can hold in China. Professor Tang has a very broad research interest and has published widely covering international relations, comparative politics, institutional economics, methodology, philosophy of the social science, political theory, and sociology. He has also developed powerful platforms for complex decision-making based on computational social sciences. He has published no less than 5 single-authored volumes, and his most recent 2 books include The Institutional Foundation of Economic Development, published by Princeton University Press in 2022, and On Social Evolution, Phenomenon and Paradigm by Routledge in 2022. His book, entitled The Social Evolution of International Politics, published by Oxford University Press in 2013, received the International Studies Association Annual Best Book Award in 2015, and he was the first Chinese and Asian, or first non-Western scholar to receive this prestigious book award. He's also the author of A Theory of Security Strategy for Our Time, Defensive Realism with Palgrave Macmillan, published in 10, and A General Theory of Institutional Change with Routledge in 11. And of course, apart from these books, many articles in leading international journals. So finally, he's also the first Chinese scholar to join the editorial board of the following journals. These are leading journals in international relations. That's International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Security Studies, and International Relations. So I am sure that you join me in welcoming Professor Tang. Professor Tang will speak for 45 minutes, after which we hopefully will have an interesting Q&A session. We've got students or colleagues that have joined us online, so we will manage. So for those who have joined us online, we know you are there, and we will Haben, who is here, will be monitoring the chat room once we reach the Q&A session. So we go.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. And thanks to Professor Van Wijnberg for the nice introduction. It was really long. It doesn't have to be that long, of course. But as Elisa has introduced, I was mostly more like IR scholars. Right? So why would I try to kind of make a foray into the economic development? It's partially because of my personal experience. I grew up in a very small, isolated, and mountainous village in southern part of Hunan. I'm not going to get into too more about my personal experience, but what I want to talk about today is actually something I have been thinking about in the past 3 or 5 years since my last book. Because my last book also, in a way, if I want to put some self-criticism, was too economics, I would put that way. Right? So I think SOAS will be a perfect place for me to kind of try this particular idea because, as all of you know, SOAS was established to more or less support the British Empire and used to be the part of the empire. And now the name is Global South. Some people don't like the term, but, I'm, morally neutral about this particular term. It's really because it has caught on. It's really a nice way of, not a very nice way, maybe, to just include all those non-Western countries, more or less. So the reason why I put the geopolitical upheaval was not because I started from IR. It's partially because once I finished my last book, it became fairly obvious and apparent that the international dimension has really been rarely integrated into the study of economic development, even for the global South, but also even for the global West. So I'm going to divide in my talk into 5 parts, which really the most central part is really the second and the third part. So first is really the very brief history about why we should study geopolitical rivalry and economic development. Are they really connected? My answer is fairly firmly yes. And then I'm going to go through the new landscape. I'm going to be fairly quick. I have some data in the diagram, but not going to be very detailed. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the challenge and the opportunity of economic development in the global South in the wide range of, in the shadow of new geopolitical landscape. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about the future of IPE, which I talk a little more in my talk this noon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology consideration because I think we need detailed, in-depth, and empirical work. Okay, so first is really a very short history about geopolitical rivalry, right? So it's really so remarkable if you read The Rise of the West, by Thomas and North, and they actually talk a little bit about the geopolitical competition, but they don't really put that in at the center of the discussion, right? So, but a simple, fairly cursory look at the European history will tell you the making of the modern European system. That's in the first wave of modernization, according to my understanding, from 1500 to 1789. It's great French Revolution was, to a very important extent, geopolitical rivalry was very inherently connected with economic development. Right, so France, in a way, tried to compete against Britain, and so they ended up with, state-centric capitalism, and Germany, of course, did the same. And the imperial competition, of course, had profound and, often devastating impact upon the global South. So the modern world capitalist system had always had a geopolitical dimension. But this has been mostly solidly ignored by mainstream economics, including, AJR, the last year's Nobel Economic Prize. So mainstream economics have been mostly about modeling economic development within a single country, as most economists will be able to tell you, right? Usually without politics, and certainly not with international politics. And I would also argue the mainstream IPE, especially the American, but also quite a bit of our European or Anglo IPE also had ignored this central dimension of international politics. So, and also IPE has been mostly concentrated on the contemporary world and mostly ignored economic development in the global South, right? So if you read some of the most important texts of IPE, they are really about the OECD country, right? But to come back to the more contemporary world, the European Union was partially made by, the Cold War, right? So there's no doubt the European Union is a product of the Cold War. And the post-1945 Global South had also endured the rivalry between USSR and United States. So in summary, geopolitical rivalry has played a very central role in shaping the course of economic development in these contemporary worlds, right? In Middle East, Africa, Latin America, South Asia. And unfortunately, most of those regions or subcontinent or sub-regions had not really been able to perform well in terms of making economic development happen. The only successful story as a region is really from the global south has been the East Asia, or what do you call the East Asian development states, right? So Charles Johnson, Epstein, Wade. So in Wade, I think EADS or development state had provide a model, or never exact, of course, for the global south. Now, I want to emphasize geopolitical rivalry between the US and the USSR during the Cold War was instrumental in shaping, or at least allowing, East Asian development state to really thrive, right? Now, the key is really the United States allowed Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., Thailand, Philippines to be able to export to the US as an ultimate consumer market. I'm not going to get into the detailed specifics about EADS, but I want to also situate the rise of China within the rise of Asia, right? So to be very honest, I'm not really assuming China will inevitably rise, right? Nobody knows. In fact, I would say China's rise faces a really great amount of uncertainty, and you see all those news, real estate bubble, contraction in terms of lending, those kind of stuff. But even if China stagnates or even eventually collapse, China as a major economy still brings a new landscape to the IPE. And I also want to emphasize the rise of China should be understood squarely within the rise of Asia, because China as a developmental state is really a variant of the East Asian variant development state. So China learned a lot of things from Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. The key lesson why we should put rise of China with rise of Asia is actually the rise of Asia, East Asia, without the rise of China carries less weight, because people will say, well, yes, all the little dragons have been able to thrive, but this at least the cradle of East Asian civilization, or much of the Confucian sphere, the Chinese could not really rise, and therefore they must have some cultural backwardness. So China's rise overall, without the overall rise of Asia, will also carry less weight. And again, development state did not really originate from Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. It actually originated from France, United States, and of course, Russia, Prussia or Germany. So a very simple kind of a recap is really through the course of modern capitalism world system, geopolitical rivalry has played a very central role, I would argue, in shaping economic development. So it should not be so outlandish to consider geopolitical rivalry and economic development together. And unfortunately, we don't do that, actually. So it's our fault that we have not really done so. Now, of course, by considering geopolitical rivalry, it does not really mean we should say, follow the structuralism or golden straitjacket to bring part of the geopolitical rivalry into the consideration of IP. What I'm only arguing is that we need to consider geopolitical rivalry as a part of a landscape of international political economy. So to quote, Susan Strange, the nature of a competition between states in the international system has fundamentally changed. Now, to give you a very recent example, it's really the Ukraine war, right? So you see the drastic shift of trade pattern before and after war. So most of the European countries have pretty much detached or delinked from the Russian economy. from the peak of before the war to now very marginal amount. In contrast, these four countries now occupy about 60% or 70% of the total trade of Russia. China occupies up half of those trade, right? So you see China, India, Turkey, and Kazakhstan, trade far more with Russia. Personally, I don't really condone, I condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I actually predicted with a very simple game model that Russia would invade Ukraine. But those two slides will show you geopolitical rivalry actually can shift drastically sometimes the pattern of international economy within a very short period of time. Okay, so I now come to the part two of my talk. It's really the central part of my talk. It's really, I'm going to advance three key aspects of the new geopolitical landscape. I'm not saying you can just name, these are the only three aspects. I'm only saying these three aspects are my take on the landscape. So why this time is so different? The first is, I think it's fairly obvious, but people may actually not really pay enough attention. It's really, this is the first time since 1800 AD, let's say, new economic powers outside the West. Before, all the major economic powers are from the West. And secondly is really the spillover of geopolitical competition. Like you see the Russia-Ukraine war is really Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon war. And whether you buy into the moral bankruptcy of the West, I put a question mark. But people certainly, at least whether you are in global South or global North, you can see the double standard under the liberal international order or rule-based international order. And third is really the global South, as we can go back to see the UN reaction to the Russian-Ukraine war, but also is really Gaza war. So the global South collectively has been able to resist certain pressure from the West. And that actually did not really occur fairly regularly before that. So the third thing is really the West as a whole has become more fragmented despite the Russian-Ukraine war, and now with Trump 2.0, right? So the West as a collective group has become more fragmented, and I think the West itself, the European Union versus the U.S., have to figure out a certain way of new way of doing business, whatever. And the fourth is really, of course, the U.S. China rivalry. As I said, I'm not arguing China is going to rise, inevitably. It may actually collapse or stagnate. But even with that, China as a new major economic power can actually stay resiliently for a fairly long period of time. So I think the U.S.-China rivalry may actually last 2 or 3 decades, right? So it's shorter than the Cold War, but also another thing is really we're going to see a world of 3 or 4 major economic powers. So before there was only within the West, today now outside the West, right? And of course, there's a very important dimension to this new political rivalry is the grabbing somebody else's territory is no longer acceptable, at least not legally. Now, I want to show a few slides about the, some of the really rough picture about the geopolitical rivalry in the past. Right? This is during the Cold War, and you see the U.S. is really like 100, right? And we can see the Soviet Union as a total economy, total GDP is only never reached above the 50% of the United States. And Germany and Japan during the Cold War years were very important allies of the United States. And certainly so, Germany and Japan and the United States belong to the collective West. This is GDP per capita, and even more apparent that the Soviet Union was a far more weaker economy than the United States, Germany, and Japan. Now we come to U.S. versus China and India. I don't really necessarily buy into the PPP indicators, but I'm saying even we take a grain of salt about the PPP data, I think the size of the Chinese economy is roughly somewhere between nominal US dollar versus PPP calculation, right? So the size of the Chinese economy, at least, is roughly around 70 to 80% about the US economy. And you guys may not really notice, but the size of the Chinese economy does not really include Hong Kong, Macau, and certainly not Taiwan, right? So the real size of the Chinese economy, if you include Hong Kong and Macau, is slightly larger than the official number, at least. Of course, China remains a very poor country relative to the United States. Its GDP per capita is about 1/6 of the US GDP per capita. But this is already a very important economic power, right? So because the size of the Chinese economy. Second part of the geopolitical rivalry or landscape is really, I would argue, there is a new sense of a more robust agency from the global south. And I will try to highlight a few things why we expect, or I think it's going to be a more robust agency from the global south. Let me just give you a very simple, very sweeping kind of an overview about the making of the contemporary world, right? So I divide the modernization of our whole planet into three big waves. The first wave was really the discovery of the quote unquote discovery of the new continent. So from 1500 to 1789, the French Revolution, right? So more or less, that first wave was really restricted to the Western Europe, UK, France, Germany. And then after the French Revolution, we begin to have the second wave because it is spread to Latin America. But you can have a sense, say, in the first wave and the second wave, the global south more or less didn't really have much agency in the sense of economic development because they don't really control their own destiny, right? So you have the colonial power, or British Empire or other, Spanish Empire. They control their colonies' economic development. So the third wave, I use a landmark date of 1945. So after after 1945, the World War II, then you have the Cold War years and then post-Cold War years. So that third wave began to allow developing countries or global south to have agency. So why would I argue that agency from the global south has been gradually building or going to increase? It's really state building. It's a very important element. State building takes time. So most developing countries or decolonized countries gaining their new independence, they begin have to do two things to get together. Right? One is state building. Sometimes they do nation building. And at the same time, they do economic development. It's a very demanding task, right? Because most of those developing countries don't really have a state history as long as, let's say, Ethiopia, China, or Turkey, whatever. They are really young countries, and therefore they have to build their own state. And sometimes because they are, multi-ethnicity countries, they have to do nation building. So, and then shortly after 1945, World War II, you have the different kind of a paradigm for developing countries, right? So big push, and therefore once you have the disappointment with the big push, then you have the coming of dependence theory, right? So only about 1970 to 89, a few scholars from really comparative politics and also comparative sociology or historian like Charles Johnson, more or less, really pay attention to the East Asian miracle. And then, of course, you have 89, 2001, then post 9/11. So the global south were mostly marginalized players in the first two waves of modernization, but they began to really accumulate state capacity, but also learning the things about economic development, about state building, and other things, and therefore they will be able to have enough knowledge base to do things they have in mind. So after 50 to 75 years of independence, more developing countries will have more state capacity, and they have, some sound institution for taking initiative, because you need a fairly, coherent or cohesive state bureaucracy to do things, to make investment in infrastructure, but also do economic planning, including running certain bureaucracy, overseeing infrastructure, schooling, and hospital, right? And the second element, which I think supports a future more robust agency from the Global South, is really some resentment from the Global South. You can see the contrast between the West's reaction in the Ukraine war and the war in the Gaza, right? So many developing countries are not really buying into the rhetoric of liberal international order or rule-based international order, even before Trump, right? Trump 2.0. And third, I would argue, as all states are now really interconnected, at least through the information highway, or with a mobile phone, with a satellite, other countries' success become a certain guidance or certain example for other countries. So East Asia, as a successful story, encourage other developing countries to be able to try to emulate certain practice from East Asia, right? And the fourth element is really China now is actually, as a global trading partner, it's now equally, I would perhaps slightly more integrated with the Global South than with the West. And to some extent, I would argue Global South is more integrated with China than with the West. This is actually very similar to what happened in 1970 during the golden years of the East Asian development state. During that particular time, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc., they ran a very severe trade deficit with Japan because they import a lot of machine tools, intermediate goods from Japan to their own production facility, and then try to process the product into the United States. So Japan ran very high trade surplus with all those called the East Asian tiger, and now we are seeing the similar pattern emerging between China and the Global South, especially in East Asian country, but also in some African country, right? So in Vietnam, Vietnam actually ran a very huge deficit with China, but then actually export quite a lot to the United States and European Union. And the final element is really the competition between U.S. and the West, more U.S., I would put it this way. U.S. in the West and China's BRICS will provide developing countries with more maneuver and leverage so they can actually play the West, U.S. versus China and BRICS. And in this particular aspect, I would say maybe China or BRICS can actually provide more things. Now, to try to kind of put some kind of a statistical support, right? So since 2022, actually China's total trade volume with the Global South has overtaken its total trade with the Global North, or OECD countries. And of course, I understand some of the trade with the Global South eventually will target the Global South, Global North. So in the long run, in the next 2 or 3 decades, we're going to see 2 trading blocks, but still with extensive interdependence. I don't see a total de-link between the West or Europe from China or BRICS. They are not going to have such a total de-link or de-risking. And even in technologies, US and EU and China cannot really decouple from each other entirely, at least. So the final sub-point about this particular long-run trend is really the US and what's the rest of the rest. And I think the EU community, the non-United States West, is more receptive to the global South. Now, partially because European countries are having more connections with the global South. So the global South will have more leverage, and therefore it actually increases space for their agency. Right? This is a very simple diagram to show that China's export to the global South have now overtaken its export to the global North. It actually happened during the COVID. Now, I want to highlight several aspects of certain possible agency by the global South. So it can have different venues. I leave out a few other things which may actually have hard data, but this is one of those possible venues actually have fairly important data now, right? So this is like a post by 2021. It's really about the cocoa producing countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana, are turning to China, and the reason is actually China now being able to buy more cocoa from Ivory Coast and Ghana, and therefore the price has gone up. But beyond that, China actually provided capital and technology, which actually Western country, including I think this was about a company about in Holland, right? So Western companies have not really been willing to do so. So the Chinese company provide capital and technology so that they can locally process cocoa and then try to export the processed product to China. And of course, with Trump 2.0, especially the United States, I think it will become more protectionist. But China and East Asia are more open to open trade, right? So you witness the ASEAN-China free trade area, but also RCEP and the CPTPP. So East Asian countries are more receptive to open trade than I think the future of the United States in the next 2 or 3 years at least. The second possible venue is actually countries between China, countries like China and other developing countries. They are no longer just trying to squeeze each other in terms of profit or whatever. They are also being able to cooperate in some really leading technological frontiers, right? So like Brazil and China, actually, they actually compete now today, at least compete in airplane manufacturing. But Brazil and China has been able to cooperate with satellite imaging system, and satellite imaging is very important now for running agriculture and also trying to map out your territory, and therefore you will be able to manage your land use and other things more efficiently. Right? So there are quite a few other things that developing countries among themselves, whether with China or without China, with Brazil or with India, they can actually do more things now than they used to be able to do by only relying on the West. The third part about this new landscape is really, I'm not really a purely technological guy, but our center actually use a lot of AI and stuff. And I come to the conclusion, this wave of new technologies is unlike what we used to have. The reason is this new wave of technology actually will be able to empower all the different sectors. Like, let's say we go back to 200 years ago. Steam engine usually impact manufacturing, transportation. But today, with mobile communication, with mobile payment, satellite imaging, you can actually have high-tech agriculture because you can have greenhouse, total control by robotics, and there actually you will be able to produce tomatoes within greenhouse 5 or 6 times rather than say 1 or 2 harvests in the wild field. Now, so agriculture can be quite high-tech. And of course, much of the financial service has already been high-tech. And even other, like food delivery, depends on mobile payment, GPS, those kind of stuff. And of course, the most exciting sector will be in the manufacturing. I'm not saying all these things will be able to help our employment. Actually, it's going to reduce employment in certain sectors, especially used to be labor-intensive manufacturing, right? So I was told, actually there was one news report about a factory in Chengdu, in western part of China. They used to produce a refrigerator and air conditioner by one of the leading Chinese appliance company. That factory used to have 2,000 or 3,000 employees. Now it only has 40 to 50. So this is going to have enormous impact on how industrial manufacturing works. But my overall assessment is this new way of technology will be able to empower all the sectors because it's truly widely applicable technology rather than, say, automation used to be only on the assembly line. Now, the unfortunate aspect of this is really very few major developing countries, only a few major developing countries like China, Brazil, and India, and Indonesia, they will have a chance to be, wave makers. They will be able to invent a few important leading technology because all this requires substantial investment in human capital and also infrastructure. But most developing countries will be able to adopt this new way of technology with relatively low cost, because all this new way of technology only require certain supply of electricity, satellite connection, but not really a very extensive or heavily capital dependent investment in roads, bridges. Those and bridges are important, are still important, but what I'm saying is this new way of technology, especially concentrated, supported by mobile communication, that requires relatively low investment. And actually, the cost is fairly small compared to investing, let's say, in high-speed railway. The third aspect of this empowering technology is the new technologies frontier. They are no longer exclusively dominated by the West. Now, the West still dominates or leads in many areas, but China, or including India and Brazil, they can actually be running at the frontier, right? And this has never been done before, right, since 1500. Now, I'm not saying all this present golden opportunities for the global South. It presents challenges. So what are the specific challenges and opportunities for the global South? And this is not really a well thought list, but I want to highlight a few things so that maybe we can begin to examine some of them in the next decade or so. Now, I want to just highlight 2 or 3 things. It's really, I think, the simple task, the central task for developing country to develop, to engineer the economic development is really to become a developmental state. Now, but you have to become a development state in the new era because the East Asian development state has been a product of Cold War. So it's highly unlikely we will be able to reproduce the East Asian development state, right? So the key challenge is really, can developing countries become developmental state in this new age of upheaval? Now, I highlight a few challenges, right? So because we're going to see the future of international competition going up, or international volatility or upheaval. So what are the concrete challenges that international upheaval impose on the global South when it comes to sustaining economic development? And second is really, economic development in the global South stagnant because usually business activities, they tend to peak or they prosper when there is peace, when there is less geopolitical tension. But now with more geopolitical tension, well, economic development in the global south stagnant. If yes, what are we going to see? Are we going to see more domestic instability? And so what kind of global south countries do in order to sustain economic development? And third, of course, there's been much talk about the more just international order has been going on for at least a half century. Now, usually when you have more international upheaval or tension, there may be greater room for the global south to try to call for more just or equal international economic order, right? So we don't have to concentrate or focus on like a more newsworthy BRICS, but it can be about Latin American countries, African Union. Can they play a more important role in shaping the future rules and organization for economic development? Fourth is more concrete and more down to earth, I would put it that way. So if the United States, especially, maybe possibly EU bank on protectionism, what will this mean for the global south? As I said, the East Asian miracle was partially because the United States were willing to become the ultimate consumer market. But now the United States may no longer be willing to do the same thing. So can China or India or Brazil or Russia, they become at least major or significant consumer market for the global south? Now, and finally, it's really the source of conflict of interest. I'm not saying global south, they are really a coherent or cohesive whole. They actually have their own disputes, conflict of interest. But can they really solve some of their own problem without jeopardizing economic development, right? So for instance, much of the tension between India and China across the border has had a very important impact on how India trade Chinese business. And now with India and China get along slightly better, while the Chinese business companies be able to do more business in India, right? There's quite a few other more specific issues. Let me be quick. Okay, so a very concrete thing is really the impact of friendly shoring or home closing or home shoring, right? So the United States wants to, bring production back to the United States or Mexico or maybe Canada. And this is actually going to have a very important shift in terms of global production network. Right, so we have already witnessed a very wide range of moving production from China to Vietnam to Mexico to India, and then this particular shift may actually have some lasting impact, and depend, of course, whether Trump is going to impose high tariff against Mexico and Canada, right? And trade pattern, of course, investment, right? So investment actually took a hit since COVID, right? But now begin to pick up. But China is now in a worse condition than, let's say, before COVID, right? So China is now in a deflation or stagnation particular set of a thing, right? So infrastructure, right? So hard infrastructure is essential to economic development. Most global south countries just don't really have the capital or make things happen. So it used to be multiple development banks, MDBs, are usually the source of capital. Now with the increase of geopolitical rivalry, particularly between China and the US and the EU, now they are trying to compete to support infrastructure building in Africa, in Latin America, and some other stuff. Energy, right? Energy and green development. But a lot of most developing countries did not really have the capacity to do green development. Another thing is with the new energy or green development, the price of oil and gas is going to eventually decrease, I would put that, because the demand for those gas and oil will actually decrease. And therefore, traditional energy export like Russia or Iran or Saudi, they have to shift some of the investment or their energy consumption production into greener energy. There's some other things I only want to highlight, really production knowledge, right? So, as I studied in the US, but also most of you study in the UK, you see the production of knowledge about development has been mostly come from the West, partially because the language has to be in English, of course. But can developing countries from the global South produce enough knowledge so that they can be able to provide certain knowledge base for the future of economic development? Let me skip some of the stuff. So I talk a little bit about the new IP in LC a little bit more, but here I want to just highlight a few things, right? Really, we have to escape from the traditional developmental economics. I can go on with a long list of critique, but the thing is, most development economics have been able to trying to do modeling within a single country. But today, it's no longer the case. You can have economic development within a single country. You have to actually heed some of the implications of international constraint, right? And of course, we have to reject the economics imperialism. So we need to bring, if we admit international competition, international or geopolitical tension, it's important for the making of a modern capitalism system, but also for economic development. We need to bring the international and domestic politics into the understanding of economic development. So I want to kind of quote, read on the first page of Adam Smith. He was actually making the argument, the most important critical factor in shaping economic performance across time and space really is an allocation or misallocation of production factors by political decisions. Because he was really talking about, how can a state or economy allocate different production factors into the proportion of productive and non-productive production. So it's economic development, I think, is more a political outcome rather than an economic outcome, right? So I called for a new IPE. I'm going to spend more time because my time is a little bit up. So I want to, I want to highlight a single fact here, right? So the key for economic development is not really to have, let's say, 8 or 10% growth per year. It's really how can you sustain a decent rate of economic development, right? So even the 4% of GDP per capita growth will allow you to double GDP per capita in 20 years, triple in 30 years. But very few countries have been able to do that. This is from my book, and some of these are what I call the lucky few, right? So very few countries have been able to achieve more than 20 years of economic growth or development with 4% GDP per capita. I skip this, all right? So let me just try to highlight some of the things which I think will be useful for us to understand why different countries were able to escape from crisis better than some other country. So this is like a very very useful way of looking at this particular phenomenon, right? So you have two financial crises, one from the Asian itself, right? 1997 Asian crisis, and then 2008 Great Crash. And you see three countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and they actually move into crisis and move out of crisis fairly differently. So Indonesia is now doing actually better than both Thailand and Malaysia, where it used to be worse, right? So I'm arguing, so this kind of a more focused comparison will be very useful for us to understand how countries can engineer and sustain economic development in the long run. Let me stop here and I welcome any comments and questions. I'm sorry I have to go quick with a lot of slides already. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, for a very comprehensive overview of both the history of development and the junctures at which we find ourselves and what that means in terms of the opportunities and challenges that the countries, as you say, in the global south face. Let me open it up for questions, comments.